Liberia, a small country located on the coast of West Africa. Founded in 1822 as a result of the American Colonization Society, who brought freed slaves from America to Africa. The coup was followed by many violent and gruesome events, and ultimately a 14-year-long civil war that led to the country's destruction. 14 years later, Liberia is in a state of recovery. The trauma and pain Liberians went through is unreal. Join us as we sit down with a few survivors living in both Liberia and America. These are their stories.
Ten years after 1980, there was an incursion that turned into a civil war where there were over 6 to 7 warring factions from different ethnic groups, and they all came into the country. They were posted, they mobilized in different regions outside of Liberia, in Guinea, in Burkina Faso, in Mali, in wherever. Mobilized, Ivory Coast, wherever, and were training to come and destabilize and overthrow President Doe's government. And I remember at that time, people were calling me, visiting me, why don't you support Charles Taylor to overthrow the government? It's a government that killed your dad. My response was, no military coup d'etat will ever be right. No killing of president will ever be right. And two wrongs will never be right. When the war started in 1980, 1990, the Civil War, people again thought, okay, let's overthrow Mr. Doe and we go along with taking the government over and running the mansion and so forth. But that experience showed us that when you get people in the streets rioting, you can never control their emotions anymore. When they start throwing rocks, then they start fighting each other, and that's what happened. You had warring factions fighting, and so the survival mode took place to be able to prevent the war. Meant they would break bridges to keep the enemy from falling, from crossing. So infrastructure was destroyed. Bridges were destroyed, schools were broken. The entire infrastructure of this country was dismantled, devastated for the 14 or 13 years of the war. At one point it started in the northeast in Nimba. It came down into Bong, it came to Monrovia, then it went to Kipamas, then it went to the northwest. But when people left this one, they would be displaced here. So people were being displaced in the country. When they get to a place where they thought it was safe, build a farm, and look, the war came about 13 years, almost like 2 generations of children born. Children, girls became sex slaves, young boys became combatants, and they were fed drugs, they were, used in a way that was very inhumane. You can watch some movies like Blood Diamond. There's another movie I met that show how young people just died. They didn't die physically, but they died morally and socially with the kind of treatment, because young boys were used as sex slaves as well as girls. And it was so, so sad. By 2003, when the war ended, by force, I think you remember that President George Bush Jr. Intervened somewhat. They could have intervened, the Americans could have intervened in 1990. But when the war started, I went to Washington, D.C. I went to the ministry, foreign ministry, and I spoke with the man for Africa, whoever was responsible for the African desk. His name was Cowan. And I said, they're killing people in Liberia. In fact, the Lutheran church had been looted, and Mr. Doe and his men went into a Lutheran church and killed 600 people that were sheltering there. Just shot and killed. And that was on public newspaper. In DC, I bought every newspaper, the Washington Post, Sun-Times, whatever newspaper, I bought them and I took them to the Foreign Affairs and I said, look at what's happening. And I read it, the last line of that article was, none of the protagonists, the president, who was George Bush Sr., I think, none of the protagonists in Liberia was worth America's while to intervene. You can find it in the newspaper on August 29 or July 29, just before the Iraq invasion. America could have intervened like this. For the whole while of the war, there was a ship patrolling the West African coast with over 200 Marines. They could have come in and just said, stop this war. And then like 10 years afterwards, President Bush said stop, and it stopped. America had that kind of power. They had not only verbal power, but they had military power to do it. But again, they didn't see the necessity to intervene then because Liberia didn't have the interest or the investment. But what I want to say, it was September 9, 1990, that America would say that none of the protagonists were worth the while. And that really is concerning, that America, who is supposed to have been the friend of America, the friend of Liberia, they didn't see it, but there's timing for everything. And so by 2003, Mr. Bush now saw that Liberia was worth its while, his son, to come and say to Charles Taylor, you must go.
One thing has to happen. Mr. Taylor needs to leave the country. And Colin's made that I made it clear publicly. I've just made it clear again. He made it clear to Kofi Annan. In order for there to be peace and stability in Liberia, Charles Taylor needs to leave now.
And Charles Taylor left in October of 2003, and then the new government, interim government was set up. There was election, and we have the interim government lasted for 3-4 years, and then President Sirleaf was elected in 2005, and she was inaugurated in 2006. When you talk about the effect of the war, the Civil War, which was so senseless and bloody, led by people who had no, first, loyalty to their country, no patriotism, because you didn't have to destroy a bridge. Neither did you have to destroy the hydroelectric plant or the entire water system. Up to 1990, when Liberia began to have good hard revenue in it, when Firestone and then Lamco and BF Goodrich, all of these big concessions came, Liberia invested in infrastructure and also in scholarships. So you had manpower trained from technical manpower, professional manpower trained gradually from 1930. Little by little, but every year there were new people being sent abroad to Europe, to America to be trained. But by 1990, we had systems developed. Education system was very highly developed. We have multilateral high schools in every county. Multilateral high schools that train students to do either academic or vocational. There was a high power medical school medical school. There was a technical university or college in Kipamas. So the medical college produced doctors, nurses, and professional medical people to serve in the country. Then you had manpower running a system. Besides the destruction of the hydroelectric plant, the destruction of the water system that provided pipe-borne water throughout this city of Bento. There were pipe-borne water from here straight to Kakata. We have fire hydrant on the highway. We have fire stations on the fire trucks in the city. So all of that was dismantled and destroyed. But that's infrastructure. Of course, the executive mansion was desecrated, the Capitol building, every good physical structure was destroyed. And so the JFK, which was the best medical center in West Africa, named and built by funds from JFK, President JFK, was completely desecrated. When I came to Liberia in 2003-04, I went to JFK, I cried. I actually cried to see the elevator shaft hanging out of the wall. And much of it has not been restored. Unfortunately, JFK is still, maybe 20% of its quality as compared to the 1990 when the war started. But to say this, where infrastructure is destroyed, let's think about the destruction of lives. That is the most concerning. You have a nation with maybe 6 million people. 70% of these are youth, ages 35 or 40 and below. 75%. It so happened that the 75% of 6 million or so are the lower educated people in the country, because the 2 generations of youth never went to good schooling, and good schooling have not been restored again. So with the education system destroyed and the manpower being produced by this system now, what will happen 12 years from now for those children who are in first grade graduating? It has the same scenario. For those children, of the 75% of children who are educated during the 14 years of civil war, or even from 1980 when the system began to decline, until now, from 80 until 2017, that's about 37 years. Of that 37 years, if a generation is about 12, let's say 12 years for educational generation, because you will start first grade, you finish 12. The country can barely afford to pay the education for 12 years, And let's say if a generation is 20 years, if you divide it at 2 generations that have come out of the country that had intermittent education, that had low quality education. Most of the professional teachers they were killed, or they had to disperse to another country because for their safety, and they had the means to go. People who didn't have the means to go stayed. And teachers who are a level of people who are at least high school graduate plus would say, okay, let me go to Ghana, or let me go to Ivory Coast, or let me go to Nigeria, or whether they went, there were many people that were immigrated from here. So those who went to Ghana, Ivory Coast, Nigeria, many of them were taken up by humanitarian groups and taken to Australia or China or Holland or Denmark. Today, there are Liberians in the diaspora all over the world. Canada, I don't know how many of them are in South America, like Brazil or Argentina or so forth, but mostly Europe, North America or Australia, and some of the African countries. But Liberians have dispersed. But those who couldn't leave and stayed had to survive. And most of their surviving mood was to take what didn't belong to them, or to kill, or just to sit in a place and people now even stop farming, because you would do your farm and people who had to survive would come and steal your product. People in this city cannot grow chickens. If you grow chickens in your yard at night, they will steal the chickens. So it has become to a state where the concern is the human development of people. So come to long story short, I found myself desiring to be the mayor. I desired to be the mayor of Bento City. I was not elected. I'm serving this position at my own will. And the president concurred with my will. She thought that it was good that I want to be the mayor, because I saw the city where I was born, where President Torbo was born, that had been developed by 1990 in a complete disaster. I thought I could bring my endowment into bear to restore some part of what had been before and to develop. So one of the areas that we focus on is education. Bento City is now determined a city, I'd say Bento, an inclusive, innovative, and productive city of learning.